The notification appeared at 3:07 in the morning. My phone was on the nightstand, face up, and the screen lit the ceiling with that pale blue glow. That means something has broken the silence you paid for. I reached over, expecting a spam call, a wrong number, maybe a delivery alert that got delayed in the system. But the name on the screen wasn't a name I'd seen in 20 years. It was a name I'd deleted from my contacts the week after her funeral. Eleanor, my grandmother, and beneath her name, a red badge, one new voicemail. From a number that has been physically disconnected since 2006, I pressed play, and what I heard changed everything I thought I knew about the silence of the dead. Part 1. The impossible notification. The voicemail was 43 seconds long. I know the length exactly because I've listened to it 47 times now. The first 3 seconds are pure static, not digital static, not the clean white noise of a bad Bluetooth connection. This is analog static, dense and layered, the kind of interference you'd hear on a rotary phone during a thunderstorm in 1985. There are crackles inside it that sound almost like breath, like someone's mouth is too close to a receiver that no longer exists. Then the voice comes through. It is my grandmother's voice. I need you to understand that I don't say that lightly. I've spent weeks trying to convince myself it's a synthetic fake, an AI voice clone scraped from some old family video I posted on social media years ago. But the cadence is wrong for AI. AI clones are too smooth. They don't pause in the middle of a word because they've forgotten what they were saying. They don't have the slight tremble in the vowel sounds that my grandmother developed after her stroke. This voice has all of it. The tremor, the pause, the breath, and it's saying something that no publicly available recording of her has ever contained. It's saying my childhood nickname, the one only she used, the one I've never written down anywhere online. Poppy. She called me Poppy, and through the static I hear her say, "Poppy, please, you have to find the key. It's still under the floor. I can't rest until you find it." Then the static swallows her whole, and the message ends. I called the number back immediately. My hands were shaking so badly I misdialed twice. When I finally got the number right, I heard 3 ascending tones, then a recorded message from the phone company I hadn't heard in decades. "The number you have dialed is not in service. Please check the number and try again." Not a disconnected line warning, not a temporary outage, not in service. That number hasn't been assigned to anyone since my grandmother's death. The phone company confirmed it the next morning. I called every department, billing, technical support, the legacy landline division. The number associated with my grandmother's account was deactivated on March 12, 2006, 3 days after her funeral. The physical copper wire that once connected her house to the local exchange was removed in 2009 during a neighborhood fiber optic upgrade. There is no infrastructure left for that call to travel through. Yet my phone received a voicemail, and voicemails don't just appear. They are data packets. They have routing headers. They leave traces, or at least, they're supposed to. This one left nothing. The timestamp on the voicemail is real. My carrier's server logs show an incoming call at 3:07 a.m. from a number that matches my grandmother's. Duration, 1 minute and 2 seconds. The voicemail itself is 43 seconds, meaning there are 19 seconds of dead air before the recording begins. When I asked the carrier to trace the call's origin, they said the routing path was incomplete. The call appears to have entered their network at a switching station that was decommissioned in 2011. I spoke to a network engineer named David, a man who has spent 30 years building and dismantling phone systems. I played him the voicemail. I showed him the server logs. He was silent for a long time. Then he said something that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. He said, "The only way this call could exist is if the signal never entered our network from the outside. It would have to originate from inside the system itself, from the dead space between exchanges, and that's not possible. That's not how any of this works." But he also told me something else. He said that in the old analog days, before everything went digital, there were documented cases of phantom calls, calls that rang on disconnected lines, calls that appeared on bills for numbers that didn't exist. The phone company called them switch ghosts, signals bouncing between decommissioned relays, finding a path that shouldn't exist, delivering voices that had no origin. He said most of those cases were eventually explained as billing errors or crossed wires, but a few of them were never explained. And in none of those cases did the caller leave a voicemail on a device that wouldn't be invented for another decade. Part 2. Tracing the digital ghost. I started digging, not metaphorically. I became obsessed with understanding how a voice from 2006 could arrive on a smartphone in 2026. I read everything I could find about VoIP routing, about how modern phone networks convert analog signals into digital packets, about the layers of infrastructure that a single call passes through. A call today is not a single continuous wire, it's a chain of fiber optic cables, cell towers, data centers, and ancient copper junctions that still exist in forgotten parts of the network, kept alive for backward compatibility. A call is assembled from fragments, and if one of those fragments is misrouted, if a packet takes a wrong turn through a server that should have been shut down years ago, the call fails. It doesn't deliver a 43-second message from a dead woman, it simply drops. I consulted 2 other experts. One was a telecommunications historian who specialized in the transition from analog to digital in the late 1990s and early 2000s. He told me about something called deadbolt signal routing, a term that isn't used anymore in the old crossbar switching systems. When a line was disconnected, the physical connection was severed, but the routing table entry sometimes remained. The system would occasionally try to complete a call to that number, sending a signal down a path that ended in a severed wire. Normally that signal would dissipate, but in extremely rare atmospheric conditions, he said, a signal could bounce. It could reflect off the ionosphere, be picked up by a different exchange, and be interpreted as an incoming call. He said it was the phone company's version of a ghost story. He'd never heard of it producing a voice message. But he also said, if something like that were to happen, the timestamp would be wrong. The call would appear to originate at the switching station, not the number itself, and it would carry whatever data was last transmitted on that frequency before it was severed, like an echo trapped in a cave for 20 years, finally finding a way out. The second expert was a forensic audio analyst. I sent her the voicemail file, uncompressed. She ran it through a series of tests, looking for signs of digital manipulation. She checked the frequency range, the compression artifacts, the waveform consistency. Her report came back with something I didn't expect. She said the audio contained frequencies that shouldn't exist in a digital recording, frequencies below 20 Hz, the sub-bass range that most microphones filter out, frequencies that only appear in analog recordings made on magnetic tape or directly on copper wire. She said if this were a hoax, the hoaxer would need access to vintage recording equipment, an original copper landline, and a switching station that still operates on 1970s infrastructure. And even then, she said, the voice pattern was too consistent. AI voice cloning leaves micro-glitches, tiny artifacts in the waveform that a trained eye can spot. This recording had none of that. She couldn't explain it. She didn't try. But the detail that broke me was this: the 19 seconds of dead air at the beginning of the voicemail. That's not silence. When she amplified it, she found something buried beneath the static. A second voice, faint, almost inaudible. A male voice, speaking in a cadence that sounded like a prayer or a warning. When she isolated that fragment and played it back, the words were just barely distinguishable. She is still here. She won't leave until you listen. I didn't sleep for 3 days after hearing that. Part 3. Echoes in the copper. My grandmother's house is still standing. Barely. It's in a small town that never recovered from the recession of the late 2000s. Half the houses on her street are boarded up. The other half are inhabited by people who don't ask questions and don't welcome strangers. I drove there on a Tuesday, because the voicemail had arrived on a Tuesday, and I was starting to believe that timing mattered. I had been going through my grandmother's old journals, the ones my mother kept in a box in the attic, and I found a reference to something she called the listening hour. Every Tuesday at 3:07 p.m., my grandmother would stop whatever she was doing and stand by the phone. She never made a call. She never answered one. She just stood there, staring at the receiver, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. My mother thought it was grief. My grandmother had lost her husband, my grandfather, in a car accident in 1978. He died at 3:07 p.m. on a Tuesday, the exact time, the exact day. For 28 years after his death, my grandmother observed that ritual, and the voicemail I received, 20 years after her own death, arrived at 3:07 a.m. on a Tuesday. That's not a coincidence, that's a pattern, and patterns can be traced. I went to the house to trace the physical line. The junction box is on the side of the house. A grey metal rectangle bleached pale by the sun. When I opened it, I expected to find nothing. I expected a hollow shell where the copper wires used to be. Instead, I found wires, old, corroded, disconnected from the main grid, but still attached to the house. They hung down like dead vines, their ends frayed and green with oxidation. But when I touched one, I felt something I cannot explain, a vibration, faint, rhythmic, almost like a pulse. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. It was 3:07 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the wire was humming. I'm not an electrician. I don't understand what I felt. I recorded it. I pressed my phone against the junction box and captured the sound. When I played it back later, amplified and filtered, it matched the sub-bass frequency the audio analyst had found in my grandmother's voicemail. The same impossible frequency, the same ghost in the copper. I went inside the house. It was empty, stripped of furniture, but the floor plan was still burned into my memory. The kitchen where she made tea, the living room where she read me stories, the hallway that led to the one door I was never allowed to open, her bedroom. After she died, my mother sealed it, not out of malice, but out of pain. She said there were too many memories in there. She said it was better to leave it closed. I had respected that for 20 years, but the voicemail had given me a clear instruction. Find the key, it's still under the floor. And I knew exactly which floorboard she meant. The loose one in her bedroom, beneath the rug, where she used to hide little chocolate coins for me to find when I was a child, a game only we knew about. I pried up the floorboard, and there, wrapped in a piece of yellowed silk, was a key. An old-fashioned brass key, tarnished but intact, with a tiny paper tag attached. The tag had 2 words in my grandmother's handwriting. For Eleanor. Eleanor was my grandmother's name. The key was for her, but it was me who found it, and I still hadn't understood what it was meant to unlock. Part 4. The distortion of grief. I want to pause here and talk about the rational explanation, because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is a story about someone who can't let go, someone whose grief has distorted their perception, who is interpreting random events as messages from the dead because the alternative, the cold, final silence, is unbearable. And I've considered that. I've spent sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling, asking myself if I'm manufacturing meaning out of coincidence. The phone company says the switching station error is theoretically possible. The audio analyst says the frequencies are real but can't explain their origin. The vibration in the wire could have been feedback from a nearby power line. The key could have been left under that floorboard decades ago. And my grandmother's voicemail could be a hoax perpetrated by someone with access to old recordings and a cruel sense of humor. I wanted to believe that, because the alternative is terrifying. If my grandmother's consciousness somehow survived the death of her body, if it is trapped in the space between telephone exchanges, if she has been trying to reach me for 20 years through static and dead air, then everything I believe about the boundary between life and death is wrong. And if she can reach me, what else can? What other voices are waiting in the copper wires, in the fiber optic cables, in the silent spaces between data packets? We've built a world that pulses with electromagnetic signals. We're swimming in a sea of invisible communication. If the dead can learn to speak through that sea, then we are never truly alone. And I'm not sure if that's a comfort or a horror. I played the voicemail for my mother. She hadn't heard her mother's voice in 20 years. I watched her face as the static gave way to the trembling syllables, to the nickname, to the plea. She went pale. Her hand went to her mouth. She said, "That's her. That's really her." And then she said something that made my blood run cold. She said, "But that's not what she sounded like when she was alive. That's what she sounded like when she was dying. That's the voice she used on her last day, in the hospital, when she was asking for you." I wasn't there when my grandmother died. I was 12 years old, and my parents thought I was too young to see her like that, so they kept me home. And my grandmother, in her final hours, was asking for her Poppy. I never knew that. My mother never told me, but the voicemail knew. The voice in the recording wasn't my grandmother at her best, it was my grandmother at her end. And that detail is not something any AI could have cloned, because it was never recorded. It existed only in my mother's memory, and in the grief of a woman who died waiting for a child who never came. Part 5. Beyond the silent exchange. The key opened something I wasn't expecting. I took it to the local historical society, where they keep records of every property in the town. The key had a number engraved on it. faint but readable. That number matched a safety deposit box at a bank that closed in 1998. The contents of that box had been transferred to a storage facility where they'd been sitting unclaimed for nearly 3 decades. I drove there, I presented the key and my identification, and the attendant brought out a small metal box, dusty and dented, sealed with a lock that turned when I inserted my grandmother's key. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to my grandmother, from my grandfather, written during the final year of his life. He was a long-haul truck driver, gone for weeks at a time, and he wrote to her every day he was away, even if he couldn't mail the letters until he reached a post office. They were love letters, profound, aching, deeply private, but one of them was different. It was dated the day before his accident, and it said, "Eleanor, if something happens to me out here, I need you to know that I'll find a way back. I don't know how, maybe through the wires, maybe through the static, but I'll find a way. I promised you forever." I meant it. He died the next day at Tray 0 Set P Ponto M on a Tuesday. My grandmother spent 28 years standing by the phone, waiting for a call that never came. And when she died, maybe she learned what he had learned. Maybe she found the path he had found, the path through the wires, the path through the static, the path that delivers a 43-second message across 20 years of silence to the one person who would understand what it meant. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I believe in signals. I believe that energy doesn't disappear. It changes form. It finds new channels. And maybe the phone network, with all its dead ends and forgotten exchanges, is serving a purpose its designers never intended. Maybe it's become a medium, a bridge, a place where the voices of the lost can still be heard, if you're willing to listen through the static. As for the hidden physical artifact, I found it inside the safety deposit box, beneath the letters, a small velvet pouch containing my grandfather's wedding ring. It had been missing since the accident. The rescue team never found it, but somehow my grandmother had it, and she left it for me, along with a note in her handwriting. The note said, "Poppy, I kept this for you. He wanted you to have it. I've been holding it long enough. Now it's yours. Keep listening. We're never as far away as you think." I'm wearing the ring now as I record this, and every Tuesday at 3:07, I put my phone on speaker and I listen to the silence. I haven't received another voicemail, but sometimes, in the spaces between the static, I can almost hear them. 2 voices now. My grandfather's low rumble, my grandmother's gentle tremor, together, at last, in the copper wires that still run beneath this town like veins. Technology is not just a tool, it's a landscape. We've built a second world out of signals and data, and that world has its own shadows, its own forgotten corners, its own ghosts. The question is not whether the dead can speak through it. The question is whether we are brave enough to listen. If your phone rings tonight at 3:07 in the morning, if the caller ID shows a name you haven't seen in 20 years, if you hear a voice that should be silent, pleading through the static, would you answer it? Would you press the phone to your ear and let the past wash over you, knowing that some signals, once received, can never be unheard? I already know my answer. I've been waiting for the call my entire life, and now that it's come, I will never hang up.